But we're going to talk a little bit about those players, and then we'll get out of here. So when we look at Alabama's roster and who was on our roster this last season and who is no longer going to be in our roster moving forward, there's going to be a lot of changes, right? Some of the changes are super obvious. We expected those changes coming into the season, right? You have guys like Mark Sears, Chris Youngblood, Cliff Amore, Grant Nelson, all entering the NBA draft. They are out of eligibility, nothing that we can do about those. We knew that those guys were going to be gone, and that was fully expected coming into the year. LeBaron Philon entered his name into the NBA draft as well, and he is a guy that we had heard a lot about potentially returning to college. Officially, he has not 100% said he's not coming back, but everything that I have heard sounds like he is gone. His statement sounded like, "Hey, I'm ready to start my next step." From what I heard, he actually hired an agent that would allow him to come back should he want to, but I really don't think that that's going to be the case. I really expect that he's going to get a late first round grade and going to stay in that NBA draft, which is more power to him, right? Nate Oates often will meet with the players and talk to them. And this is something that really helps us, right? When LeBaron Philon makes this decision and decides, "Hey, I'm going to stay," what that does is that doesn't put us in the situation that we had with Chuck, a couple of years ago, right? Alabama was fully expecting Chuck to come back because he wasn't getting a first round grade. And kind of typically the way Nate does these is, you go meet with the NBA, you do the draft, combine, etc. And then if you get the first round grade, he of course wants you to stay if you get a first round promise. However, if you get the second round or an undrafted promise, the expectation in most cases that you would come back. The expectation with Chuck is that he was going to come back, and then he ends up staying in the draft, which is the reason why Alabama had to go out and get like Muhammad Wagi, which was not the player that we were wanting to get back. It was more of we wanted Chuck back. And so when you have a guy like LeBaron Philon that does go ahead and put his name in the draft and make it official, like, "Hey, I'm going to be in the draft. This is what I plan to do." What it does is it frees up some NIL capital for you, right? Alabama doesn't just have to put money aside on the expectation that, hey, if LeBaron Philon comes back, we're going to need a fairly large NIL chunk for him because he's an elite player, right? Somebody that's around that, even round 2 draft capital, they're going to be, a starter in the Power 5. Like, you need a decent NIL chunk for them. So he is somebody that that doesn't have to happen because of how he made this announcement. An additional thing is you also can go to other star point guards and talk to them and say, "Hey, there is, we don't have somebody else on the table, right? We don't have some other guy that's planning to come in that is afraid of LeBaron Philon coming back," right? Whether you're talking to a Cedric Coward or, previously a Jaron Pierre, or the different guys who Alabama's kind of talked throughout this process, and we will see who Alabama ends up landing. But the lead guards that you talk to, Alabama has to make sure that they have the available has to make sure they have the spot available, right? Because some of these guys are going to be afraid to come back if they think LeBaron Philon potentially is going to come back. It just can scare people off because they're worried about the potential starting spot of a guy who's been there the year before, right? A couple of guys that have announced they will be returning, however, right? You have some other guys that then announced, "Hey, we're coming back." The guys that have announced we're coming back: Aiden Holloway, Aiden Sherrill, Houston Millette, Latrell Wrightsell. All 4 of those guys have announced they're coming back. That's great to hear. That's really, really good to hear. The guys who I haven't mentioned to this point have actually all mentioned that they're going to the transfer portal. Some of these are surprising. Some of these are not. Jaron Stevenson is a guy who, Nate Oates really likes, has loved the whole time he's been here. Nate was kind of enamored with the idea of a 6'11", 3 in our system. We tried him at the 3 a few times this year. It just really never worked out. It really felt like it was a mental block for Jaron. If he ever could just kind of flip the switch and get that attacking mentality, it really felt like he was going to have what it took. but unfortunately it never really worked out. I fully expect him to go back to North Carolina. Obviously being a legacy at UNC, that's, I expect him to be in the state of North Carolina next season. I understand it. It's not something that I feel bad about, but that is one where completely makes sense, why he would enter the portal. Is somebody that I thought, had some potential, and there's a reason, obviously, that he started and played a substantial amount for us. We'll never forget what he did against Clemson to get us to the Elite Eight, right? Forever respect for that. But, that is a guy that ends up entering the transfer portal. Another guy that enters the transfer portal that wasn't a full, huge surprise was Darian Reed. Darian Reed is a guy who, if you followed his recruitment, it was messy at the very minimum. His family is very involved in his recruiting process, and a lot of reports are that his family was not super happy with Nate Oates, even throughout the recruiting process. And, there's some question marks as to the validity and the intensity of his injury. We will see, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on that. But I will say that at a bare minimum, his family and his agency played some role in this leave of Alabama, right? Some of the reports are Darian really likes Alabama. Some of the reports are there's some skepticism there. I've heard a lot of different things as it relates to that, but nevertheless, he did enter the transfer portal. I would not expect him to be back. This is a situation where I expect probably Georgia, North Carolina State, some of the schools like that to potentially be involved. I know Georgia is a school that his family really liked coming out, and obviously being from the state of Georgia, that would not surprise me even a little bit. And then the last guy is probably the most controversial to have entered the portal, and it's Mohamoud Diabate, a guy that we have talked very positively about on this show. We have talked very positively about in my threads, over the course of this last 2 years, have talked very, very positively about. He's a guy that's, been a glue guy for Alabama. He's done all the right things from a blue-collar perspective and has honestly been a very stalwart on the team. His reason for leaving the university is purely a money decision. And I can't fault the guy for money, right? I'm not going to sit here and say, as a professional, right, I do other things for a living, that if I was offered more money to do the same job, that I would not potentially take that, right? I cannot get mad at him for doing that. But that's what ended up happening in this case, right? This was a situation where, from the reports that I have heard, Mohamoud Diabate was offered a certain amount with Alabama. He agreed in principle to that amount, never signed the deal. His agency, had gotten offers from some other teams, came back to renegotiate with Alabama. Alabama kind of held firm, tried to renegotiate on a couple of occasions, and then eventually entered the transfer portal, signing with Kentucky, right? Originally, we had thought that he was potentially going to be signing with like a St. John's or somebody up from the upper Northeast, back where he's from. However, Kentucky ends up, being the landing spot, and all the reports that I have heard have been this was like I said, almost an entirely a money decision. Because from a scheme fit, it doesn't exactly make sense, right? Mohamoud Diabate, obviously a physical guy, so right, if Kentucky's looking for, hey, we want to get the physicality, it makes sense from the Kentucky side of things. What it doesn't make sense from is the Mohamoud Diabate side of things, right? Obviously, he brings them the physicality, but what do they bring him in their style of offense, right? Maybe you're looking at, he shot 40% for three, but he shot 46% from three, but he shot 26 threes all year, right? He was 12 of 26. He was not a high volume guy. He is not a guy that's going to be one that you want to shoot 60 threes a year. So I'm not exactly sure on the fit standpoint from that point. Like I said, I'm not going to shame the guy. If you want to make more money and do the same job, by all means, do it, right? Again, as somebody who's in the business world, I fully understand it. I am not upset by it, but that is kind of the facts and the reality of the situation. Is this was one that Nate and staff did try to retain, but matching the number that he was offered by Kentucky just didn't make sense from an Alabama NIL perspective. Alabama obviously does have a decent NIL, war chest, if you want to call it such, for basketball. It's not at the level of a Kentucky or a Duke or somebody like that, but it is a substantial amount. I've heard top 5-ish in the SEC. So it is an amount that is very capable of getting top talent. But if you're talking about allocating resources, the amount that Kentucky allocated for a guy that does very good things for us, but also plays a certain role in our system that potentially would not be expanding just due to his offensive skill set, is something that just didn't make sense for Alabama to match that offer. So best of luck to him at Kentucky. Alabama will play them obviously this year, and we will see how that works out. But that is a guy that has already committed. Like I said, Mohamoud Diabate has committed to Kentucky. That's kind of the situation and how that one went. It was one that Nate did try to retain. Like I said, we gave a very competitive offer up front that apparently, like I said, based on some of my sources and what I have heard, sounds like he may have agreed to in principle. And then decide not to move forward with signing said contract. So that's kind of how the roster as of the current moment looks like. So if you're talking about the guys on our roster today, and we're not talking about the transfers, I'm going to have a whole different episode, and we're going to break down transfers in their own episode. But as of the current guys on the roster today that we knew kind of from last year's team plus the incoming freshmen, we've got Houston Millette, we've got Latrell Wrightsell, we've got Aiden Holloway, we've got Aiden Sherrill, right? Those are your 4 big guys. One last guy that entered the transfer portal was Nas Cunningham. The reason I didn't mention him, if you kind of followed the show or have listened to anything I've done, that one was one we fully expected to kind of happen as soon as the transfer portal opened. I've heard some reports he may end up coming back. I don't know the validity of that. It may be true, may not, but I would not expect it to happen unless he's kind of into the bench. He didn't find a better spot, so you're going to come back to Alabama and just try to keep working and see what you can do. If that ends up being the case, more power to him, but he is one that did enter the portal. We will see where he ends up at as well. But right, the guys who we do have coming back are Houston Millette, Aiden Sherrill, Aiden Holloway, and then Latrell Wrightsell. Then you do have the 3 incoming guys that you have already signed from Davion Hannah, Amari Allen, and London Jemison. So as of this very moment, that's what your roster looks like. I fully expect some additional transfer portal stuff to come through. Kind of a sneak preview of that is Alabama has already got commitments from Noah Williamson, Jalil Bethia, and Taylor Bowen. So Noah Williamson from being a 7-foot center from Bucknell. You have Taylor Bowen, the 6'11" forward from Florida State, and then Jalil Bethia, a 5-star or previous 5-star 6'5" guard from Miami. Bethia, a guy we really wanted last season. Miami outbid us from an NIL perspective. Alabama's able to kind of get the commitment of a really, really talented sharpshooter that we tried to get last season. So that's who we've already got, right? So the roster's up to 10 guys at this point. The 4 returners we talked about, the three freshmen we discussed, and then the 3 transfers that have already committed. There are other transfers I fully expect to happen. I'm not sure how many roster spots we plan to fill. I fully expect at least 1 to 2 more guys. I'm not sure how many roster spots Nate's going to look to fill with the roster actually opening up 2 more spots. I've not heard if the SEC is fully opening those roster spots or how that's going to work out, but Alabama has plenty of spots to work with. Alabama has a few things that they still need to fill. The number 1 spot right now is a lead guard, so that's what they're looking at from like a Cedric Coward perspective. He's the current target that we've heard the most about. As of this moment of this recording, it's between Alabama and Duke, so we will see how that ends up working out if Alabama is able to close out and get Cedric Coward from Washington State. So that's currently what the outlook looks like from a transfer perspective. As I said, we'll talk much more about the transfer portal after the close of the transfer portal, and hopefully on the next episode I will also have the information about the potential partnership that I'm going to be entering into from an audio podcast perspective. So anybody that listens over on Apple and Spotify, nothing will change for you guys, but there may be some additional stuff that's coming that I will let you guys know about once that takes place. So Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I really appreciate all the support on this. Like I said, I would not be able to even have these discussions if it was not for everybody listening, watching, commenting, subscribing. So if you do appreciate the content that I have, please put it down in the subscription. I really would appreciate it. If you have any questions, anything at all, throw it down in the comments. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode.